Paul Law is our guest today. I have to find you on this list. So Paul is now spotlighted for everyone. This reading is by Valerie Kaur, and Reverend Margolese quoted her last week in her sermon, and then I was in a webinar on Thursday and somebody else quoted her, and I just finished reading her book, which is called See No Stranger. And her whole idea is that we're all connected, that we are all one, essentially, and that she says, you are just a part of me that I don't know yet. And it's one of the things I love about Elder Tree is I don't really know you, Paul, but you're going to tell us about yourself, and we will be curious and wonder about what your life was about. So I'm going to read you an excerpt from Valerie's book, which I really quite love. Speaking of which, she says, love is more than a feeling. Love is a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, and life-giving, a choice we make over and over again. If love is sweet labor, love can be taught, modeled, and practiced. This labor engages all our emotions. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger protects that which is loved. And when we think we have reached our limit, wonder is the act that returns us to love. So Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you so we can wonder about you.
It sounds ominous. Okay, well, I've written this all out, so I'm reading it from the computer screen. That way, we will not be here for 2 hours, and I won't have skipped anything. So we start out with my early family. I was born September 19th, 1934. And if you know your math, that was 86 plus years ago. I was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, at the time well known for cotton mills. The Industrial Revolution moved from England to Lowell in the early 1800s. At night, you could hear the rumble of the mills. It was a big industrial complex. My father, Arthur, worked on the equivalent of RG&E called the Lowell Electric Light, and thus he kept employment throughout the Depression. Later, he worked as an independent refrigeration repairman and then as an electrician in the mills. My mother, Gertrude, also known as Trudy, was a stay-at-home mom, except during WW2 when she assembled parachutes and later was a photo printer in a small shop. Brother Douglas arrived 2 years later. We had a happy childhood, good parents, good neighborhood. Was very fortunate. I was the student, and Doug didn't have patience for it. So Doug followed a series of blue-collar jobs throughout his life. He passed in 2009 of throat cancer. He and his wife, nicknamed Snooky, provided 5 marvelous children, 4 nieces and a nephew. I'm still close to all of them. I went to the local college while living at home. That was the only thing I could afford to do. That was Lowell Technological Institute, previously Lowell Textile Institute, and now UMass Lowell. I studied textile chemistry with a 4-year scholarship, which covered tuition, fees, and books. It totaled $500 a year, and I still had money left over to pay my fraternity dues. The world's changed quite a lot. I joined fraternity and learned to drink. That seemed to be the major course there. And this solved my anxiety problem, as it had from my dad. We'll talk more about this later. I worked for 6 years in high school and college, part-time in the personnel office of one of the largest cotton mills. The job sent me out into the mill and convinced me that I did not want that life, so college was the route that I took. It would cover education and career. After graduation from Lowell Tech, I wanted very much to get away from the Milltown world and took a job at Dow Corning in Midland, Michigan. This was well before the breast augmentation issues with silicones. After 2 years, graduate school looked interesting. Michigan State held evening classes in chemistry on evenings in Midland. I decided to pack up and move to East Lansing, where I had been accepted in the chemistry graduate program. My plan was to get a master's, but that soon changed to the PhD program. In 4 years, that's 7 days a week, 12 months of the year, I had completed the coursework, published my research, and had my degree in hand. I wanted to teach at the university level, so I obtained a postdoctoral fellowship at the newly formed Institute for Molecular Biophysics at Florida State University in Tallahassee. Being in a position to study faculty dynamics and priorities, such as, does your lab have more square footage than mine? How will I secure enough grant money to fund my research and pay my grad students? I realized there wasn't a lot of emphasis put on teaching and decided this was not the life for me. I started taking job interviews through the University Placement Office. Ultimately, I took a position in the research labs of Eastman Kodak here in Rochester. This was in 1963, at the height of the halcyon days at Kodak. I always used to joke that Kodak's biggest problem was having enough trucks to take the money to the bank. That certainly changed in later years. Seeing more opportunities from growth, I transferred to film manufacturing in Kodak Park, and this was a good choice for me. In about 10 years after I moved there, I was asked to assess the feasibility and structure of a new venture, which was clinical products. I offered a get well plan, which restructured the organization and put in some new management. Now I was ready to go back to my film assignment, but I was told to take charge of the project and implement my recommendations, which I did for about 10 years. I then moved to motion picture management, responsible for cost reduction, product delivery, and quality as seen by the customers. You have to remember that we had to deliver on all of that because Kodak was the highest price producer in the world. So you had to make those costs worthwhile. An amazing benefit for me was the opportunity to attend the Academy Awards. That was the year that Jack Palance did a one-arm push-up. This was the best assignment I had in 32 years at Kodak. I retired in a buyout plan in 1996. Even before I had emptied my desk, I was offered a job in Hollywood by the then third largest film lab in the world, Consolidated Film Industries, or CFI. I was vice president of operations and engineering. We printed and processed all the IMAX films, plus many other Hollywood productions. The last film I was involved with was Titanic. Hollywood was spectacular. If you saw somebody who looked like your favorite star, it was. We met many notable performers. My irrepressible second wife, Inez, had a great time. Once, after a fundraiser where Milton Berle was the headliner, she ran up to him, threw her arms around his neck, saying, "I love you, Uncle Milty." We belong to the California Yacht Club, full of prominent folks, including some TV and movie stars. I particularly remember Inez having a prolonged conversation with Florence Henderson, comparing her TV series, The Brady Bunch, with Inez's brood of 6 teenagers. I love the challenge and excitement of the big time world and Hollywood. However, Inez, as I mentioned, my second wife and love of my life, was miserable. She was a people person, and LA was too big to make meaningful connections. High work stress and too much alcohol led me to agree to move back home to live longer. Drugs and coke were very common in Hollywood. I never tried coke or any other drugs, but we moved back to Rochester and lived happily until she died from pancreatic cancer in 2010. I was her sole caretaker for over 3 years. The next chapter is marriage, divorce, marriage, and a widower's life. I married Donna while in graduate school with her my New England accent, Donner. Her name is Donna. While in graduate school, we had a son in Tallahassee and a daughter 2 years later in Rochester. We were both disillusioned Protestants and wanted something worthwhile to teach our children. After seeing a feature article in the Democrat Chronicle on First Unitarian, we started attending in 1994 when Bob West was the minister. As idealist dreamers, we wanted a larger family and knew that there were unadoptable children in the community. In the course of 1 year, we adopted 2 boys as infants, each with some level of health issues, which have not caused problems in over 30 years. This gave us a family of 1 girl and 3 sons, a handful. And the family grew later. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Later, Donna found greener grass, and in 1979, she left me and her 4 children, so the children were with me. Surely my work stress and drinking aggressively aggravated home life. We divorced, and it was not amicable. When Donna left, I stopped attending First U. Dick Gilbert was then the minister. I met Inez, fell wildly in love, and we married. Dick Gilbert did the honors. And in 1980, that was in 1981, at our home in Irondequoit, with 6 children, friends, and family. She had 2 children, and I brought 4. Now, high school was very interesting because the 4 boys were within 2 years of age. Later, they all married and have given us 20 grandchildren. We were together just short of 30 years. During that time, I attended Catholic Mass with her and ultimately became a Catholic. I became disillusioned by the reduction of lay member influence in the parish. We went to St. Michael's on North Clinton. The pedophilia and corruption. I knew of several cash and valuables thefts by local clergy, and I stopped attending. Inez passed in 2010, and I floated untethered and ultimately returned to First U around 2013. I survived the Scott Taylor, Karen Anderson debacle, and I'm still there among wonderful friends. We aren't perfect at First U, but this is home for me. For years, I had known that alcohol calmed my anxiety, but of course created other problems at home. My dad, my brother, most of his children, and my oldest son have had anxiety issues. I have a wonderful girlfriend whom I met 6 years ago. She's caused me to probe why, if I'm taking anti-anxiety medication, which I started when Inez was sick, why, if I took that medicine, did I need to continue drinking to calm me down? It was a really good question. And after much introspection, I started a phase out process, and it worked. I drink occasionally with no desire for more. This has opened a whole new life for me. Thank you, my dear Annabeth. Okay, we get to interests outside of work and home. In the early years, I built Heathkit sound systems, like everybody else in early 20s. No, in their age of early 20s. No knowledge required, just read the directions. I also developed and printed my black and white photos in an attic darkroom that my dad and I built. When I moved here, a friend invited me to go sailing on his boat. I was hooked, joined the Brockport Yacht Club, and bought a boat. The whole family enjoyed the experience. Of course, this led to the need for a bigger boat, which ultimately was too large for the docks at Brockport Yacht Club. We moved to the Rochester Yacht Club, where my last boat was the 34-foot Catalina. Inez loved the boat when it was docked. She would not sail. When I sailed to the other side of the lake, she would drive around and meet me. I had a girl at every port, but it was the same girl. I was a member of RYC for 36 years until COVID convinced me that paying dues to a club I couldn't attend was wasteful. When I retired from work, I was concerned that I would go brain dead just staying at home. A friend recommended the Downtown Rotary Club. He had joined 2 years earlier to deal with the same concern. I soon was deeply involved in the School 8 program, not unlike what First U does, and was coordinator for those programs for 7 years. When Inez became immunocompressed because of her chemo, I stepped out of School 8. I'm still with Rotary on my 23rd year. I've always been fascinated by pipe organs, both the instrument itself and the music. I joined the Rochester Theater Organ Society and worked on their maintenance crew, getting up close and personal with these monsters. RTOS owns the organ in the Auditorium Theater and the one in the Eisenart Auditorium at Rochester Museum and Science Center. I've also spent 20 years as curator of the instrument at St. Michael's Church. They had no money for this, so Inez and I funded all costs for organ upkeep. I thought of a pipe organ in my home. I thought that would be great. Inez wasn't enthused, so I continued upgrading my electronic instrument. Subsequently, I assembled a virtual pipe organ using parts and assemblies recommended by the manufacturers and websites. I now have a 3-manual instrument with 5 organs in the computer memory and 5 speakers distributed throughout the room. I don't play well, and I won't play in front of anybody, but it's a good outlet for me for years to come. That's the end of my story up to date.
Well, thank you, Paul. I see the organ behind you now, which I hadn't noticed before you mentioned that. So I'm going to open this up for questions. If you, first of all, I'm going to take Paul out of the spotlight, so we're back in gallery view. Down on